to get us started, I think what I'll do is I'll introduce us to the theme for this morning. It's theme 4. And we are looking at economics and geopolitics, focusing on the complex entanglements and the ethical implications of how do we take relationships seriously in research against the backdrop that we are working within and against issues of politics, funding, power dynamics, and labor issues. So today we're asking you to really take a deep dive early in the morning after a wild party to really consider and think about ethics differently, okay? We've got 3 presenters here today that are representative of also, I think, a great platform to talk to you about different challenges and experiences that they have had within the case studies that they will talk to you about this morning, and from different parts of the world. So I'm going to ask Marlon to talk about some of these deliberations that they will speak to us about before we introduce you to our presenters. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I think just to add perhaps to what Jacinta is saying is that I think part of what we've been wanting to talk about and part of, I think, what the background paper is doing is there seems to be lots of focus, and rightly so, on thinking internally about how do we tinker with partnerships to make it more equitable. And I think that's important work and we must keep doing that. But I think we also have a tendency to think that partnerships almost exist in a bit of a vacuum, that it's somehow not attached in the real world and not embedded within very particular systems, but also in global systems. And so I guess part of what this session is wanting to do is to think about how partnerships are entangled in those relationships and are co-produced, right? And that actually it's a bi-directional thing. So partnerships are influenced by the external world and they influence the external world. And so we also need to take all of those relationships seriously when thinking about the ethics of partnerships and particularly what it means to think about equitable partnerships and reimagining those partnerships in radically different ways, as we've been discussing yesterday and then certainly in the previous session.
So some things we're going to ask you to focus on is, for example, aspects around care, ethical principles or aspects that speak to the continuity of the research, not just before and during, but also after the research has taken place. And in particular, we want to ask you to think about exactly what is an equitable partnership in this context. So our first presenter this morning is Brenda Oderu. Brenda is going to argue that global health funding models have long fostered structural dependency. She's also going to speak to you about the undermining accountability and trust aspect of this. The United States' sudden withdrawal of funding for essential HIV/TB research in South Africa is a glaring example of exposing those significant cracks that we have in the system or the landscape of research. Brenda's work is going to demonstrate to us this morning that there could be, and we can envisage, alternate models. She's going to highlight that the South African case study is a typical, or at least one way in which this has shown itself, where national government has implemented some stopgap measures and also other emergency funding alternatives. Brenda, we'd like to welcome you forward. She's going to identify also the core values that are necessary for us to fully realize some of these efforts. Thank you, Brenda.
Sorry, I have a problem with so we need to move to table instead.
Oh.
So.
Okay, and having said that, we're going to move on to our next presenter because the PowerPoint is not working right now. So hold that one, Brenda. Okay. Right.
Okay, so we have to do a bit of flip there, obviously. Sorry, Brenda. Sorry to take you up unexpectedly. So we'll circle back to global funding, but I think Tegu's presentation and his work which examines the role of language translators' contributions, which are often unrecognized and unpaid in scientific knowledge production. I think and I mean, Tegi will obviously describe his work, but I think partly what's important here is particularly those implicit relationships about how partnerships get to shape the world and is shaped internally by the world, beyond the very often explicit things that we like to think about. And I think Tegi's work foregrounds how seriously we need to take how partnerships too are part of creating not just inequities within those partnerships, but outside in the world as well. So thank you. And thank you for being flexible.
Thank you, Madeline. And Jacinta?
You okay?
Yeah.
You all right?
Yeah. Good. Morning, everyone. With this title, as what Marlene and Jacinta have alluded before, I'm going to discuss about an important piece of activity within the knowledge production, unfortunately have suffered from invisibility in research ecosystem, and from there, I will show how the case actually highlighted an imbalance in the epistemic authority itself. The piece of activity is actually language translation of high quality research evidence that aims at helping the public make informed healthcare decisions. Can I get the slide move on? I don't have the tool there.
It was just
here.
David.
All right, sorry. Yeah. Okay. I will start with highlighting who are the people that actually sustain the activity. Then I will move into arguing the value of the work, which unfortunately often undermine a simple communicating information, which is language conduit. From there, I will discuss the ethical tensions that come with the situation before I finally will attempt to propose sort of a framework on how we can improve the situation. This is Cochrane, a global research partnership aiming at providing high-quality healthcare information through evidence synthesis mechanisms, through systematic reviews. Part of its mission is to make the evidence available to as many people as possible. From there, then came the realization of the need of multilingualism. Then Cochrane felt the need. Cochrane decided back in 2015 to start translation initiative, where summaries of the systematic review outcome are translated to local languages. As of now, you will see at least 20 languages where the information was translated into. Cochrane Malaysia is actually one of the first adopter of this project back into 2015, which I've been very proud to be part of, to lead the initiative since the inception. The ultimate aim of the activity is actually evidence equity. Yeah? We are trying to get evidence reaching everywhere, regardless of language barrier. Yet I will spend some time later explaining how such activity have actually unintentionally led to unequal distribution of power in knowledge production. Yeah. Can I move on? Yeah. First, we need to realize that translation is not simply a downstream communication task. It's not simply change of word per word. It is actually a co-creative act that shapes how knowledge is understood and used locally. when translation is treated merely as dissemination, as a language conduit of scientific information, then the entire layer of intellectual labor becomes invisible. With this, I'd like to highlight what we have achieved since 2015. We have translated, as I checked this morning, it's actually not 4,000 plus, but 5,000 plus summaries from Cochrane evidence into Bahasa Malaysia. This involves volunteers, students, carers, and academics in their early career, mostly. These translations reach millions of readers. Yet behind that visibility lies unpaid, unacknowledged, and structurally peripheral work. If you want to explore further this work and what we have done in Malaysia, there is a paper published earlier this year that I'd like to encourage you to read. Then, with that, here lies the paradox where LMIC partners make global reach possible but remain marginal to decision making, to authorship, or to funding, which are central in knowledge production system. The system depends on their labor, but epistemic power concentrates away from them. In the coming slides, I'm going to highlight 3 ethical tensions and then summarize them into an understanding about what I think actually happened. I'd like to highlight this as the first ethical tension arising from the situation. Volunteerism can be virtuous, but when entire global systems rely on unpaid LMIC labor to remain functional, we actually cross moral limits. Sustainability and fairness demand recognition that translation is work, not a hobby. So relying on unpaid LMIC volunteers to sustain global knowledge dissemination can obscure questions about fair compensation, labor dignity, and sustainability. And then this as the second ethical tension, which reflects on deeper epistemic hierarchy, where the global north defines knowledge, and then the south performs the labor that sustains it. Translation becomes metaphor for dependency itself, unfortunately. This is then the third one, what I feel as the recognition gap. Thousands of hours of intellectual work rarely translate into academic credit. Current authorship and reward systems deliberately exclude translators' community from being recognized. Yeah? Despite thousands of hours of what they have contributed, they are rarely credited in a way that counts towards academic advancement. Taken together, the 3 ethical tensions actually highlight an inherent situation of imbalance in epistemic authority. Data and labor originate in the global south, the raw material of science. These then flow to the north, where the theory, governance, and funding consolidate recognition. The research outcomes, policies, guidelines, and publications then return to the south, but simply as implementer, receiver of the outcome. It's a circulation of dependency rather than co-creation, a structural imbalance that translation work reveals actually most clearly. Yeah. I think all that should bring us these normative questions. Okay, that we must ask whenever we talk about equitable partnerships, including translation activity. First, what actually constitutes a partnership in knowledge translation? Beyond shared outputs, true partnership requires recognizing the interdependence between those who produce, those who translate, and those who apply the knowledge. Should translation be viewed as technical add-on or a co-creative research act? treating translation as purely technical tasks will obscure the intellectual and ethical dimensions of the work. Then, last, how can labor and authorship be redistributed? Redistribution itself will involve moving beyond token acknowledgement to structural inclusion through credits such as co-authorship, compensated roles, and participatory governance models that value LMIC contributions as epistemic partners and not peripheral labor. With that, I'd like to propose a practical ethical tool that I coined Translation Equity Assessment Tool, or TEAP. This is a structured self-assessment for organizations to evaluate how equitable their translation partnerships are. So in the next slide, I'm going to elaborate what are they. There are 4 components of that. First is labor value. It asks questions about, are translators appropriately supported, trained, and when possible, compensated? Is their contribution acknowledged in ways that are meaningful within academic and professional systems? The second component is governance inclusion. Are LMICs, translation, the lead of these activities, and the regional stakeholders of these activities involved in strategic planning and decision making? The third one is recognition mechanism. Ask questions, are there structured pathways for contributors to be visibly credited through authorship, project reports, or professional development support? And the last one is community alignments. Are translation priorities informed by the needs and voices of the communities being served? Are translated materials actually evaluated for cultural and contextual appropriateness? That tool, I hope, will help towards building resilience in research partnerships. And resilience itself is actually not only a question of finance. It's not only a financial question. It's actually an ethical and overarching question, whether we can move towards having the capacity to acknowledge interdependence, where governance is redistributed and labor for that knowledge production sustain the dignity. But looking at the bigger picture, what we need is an beyond capacity building is actually an LMIC-led ecosystem of knowledge production. We take the translation units, it has to be embedded in local research pipelines, South-South collaboration, and community-defined priorities. That's how we move from dependency to autonomy. Lastly, this is what I want to say. Where global health with global partnerships is trying to tackle inequity, to make it truly work, we must be aware of the threat, where it might actually reproduce inequity. We don't want that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Tegu. And apologies to the audience for the mix-up. Apparently the PowerPoint didn't load up early. So I'd like to now introduce you to Brenda. She will do her presentation now. Remember, this theme is about the political and economic backdrop that we have, that are challenges within the funding ecosystem. And so Brenda is going to present to us the South African case study this morning and talk to us about some of the challenges and then the alternative methods that have been looked at within the South African context of the government, as well as some of the remedies that have been put in place in the effort to try and rescue us in that situation. Thank you, Brenda.
So early this year, a single political decision created a disruption It erased 6,000 grants and shut down 30 clinical trials in South Africa in a single day. This is not just a statistic, it's a system failure. Today we're going to be discussing how there are cracks within a system built on dependence on donor capital. I am Brenda Athiambo-Odero, and I'm going to take you through a crisis that occurred. I will show you the crisis events. I will show you the ethical issues that were revealed through this crisis. I will show you how South Africa attempted to rebuild after donor capital was withdrawn. And we'll see some global reforms that occurred as well. But first, the epicenter. South Africa has one of the world's strongest and powerful HIV and TB research hubs, with 50+ trials and 7.7 million lives linked to this research ecosystem. So this means there's so much success to the point of 30 years of capacity was built within South Africa. But behind this success, beneath this success, something was brewing. There was a fault line. There was something that was hidden that was going to be happening. Remember, I said there was a political decision that was made that led to a crisis. And the hidden fault line rested on fragile ground. With 30 years of success, there was heavy reliance on external funding, donor capital. And a disclaimer, South Africa's government actually assists with research funding. So they don't really rely on external funding alone. They also rely on external donors, philanthropic organizations as well. And the scientific work deeply intertwined with clinical care. Dependency was the invisible architecture. So here the cracks we see, the fault line that we see here is dependency. So what happened? We're going to be looking at different shocks, what happened in January, what happened in February and May. And in January, PEPFAR and USAID abruptly froze support. 6,000 grants were halted globally, and South African clinics were destabilized overnight. By February, we have the second shock in South Africa. CDC halted grant support, jobs were frozen, recruitment was also frozen, and teams were entering crisis mode. And then we go to the third shock in May, where we get the breaking point. By May, NIH had banned all foreign sub-awards. 70% of South Africa's HIV and TB research funding disappeared instantly. 39 clinical trials were suspended, and nearly 50 studies halted or were at risk of being halted. We're now at the breaking point. Funding has stopped, so what do we do now? But then again, what happened? So what happened next, we can see the trials were stopped midstream, participants were left without medication or care, and staff's livelihood were at risk, so meaning people's jobs were taken away from them. We see that ethical issues would be brewing in real time, and we'll be looking at accountability, responsibility, and distributive justice. So the case brings out ethical issues. The first ethical issue that is exposed or revealed is accountability. If political decisions are made and affect participants, who is accountable? Decisions were made externally, away from where the research was being done, away from participants, but the effects were felt locally. The harm was felt locally, from jobs, from participant care. No mechanisms of shared accountability. So they left South Africa with the problem. And I know many LMICs felt these shocks, not just South Africa. Communities and researchers bore the harm of decisions made externally. So they did not have a say. The power was not with them. The power was with external donor capitals. They did not have any way of influencing the decisions made externally. The other ethical issue that was exposed was responsibility. When such a decision happens, who is responsible for the harm caused? It was fragmented and it was unequal. When clinical trial depends on external actors, responsibility becomes unclear. Despite having contracts, it should go beyond the contracts. It should be a moral duty to take care of what's happening on the ground. That means the research participants, the people who have jobs, the local knowledge. Funders had decisive power over continuity of care. We did not. Participants entered trials in trust and were removed without support, so they have nowhere to go. The other is distributive justice. Clearly, there's a power asymmetry here. One day we have funding, one day we have jobs, tomorrow you receive an email or call saying, there's no money. Leave where you're working and move on with your lives. And South Africa did. Local researchers built the strongest capacity, 30 years of local capacity built, but they held the weakest power. They couldn't go back to the table and say, all the clinical trials midstream or any trial we have midstream, kindly just leave the funding to us. That didn't happen because they did not hold the power. And when you're distributing benefits and harms, it should be equal, but there was no equal distribution of harms, there was no equal distribution of benefits. And the local South Africa had no power. So who leads, who decides? Who absorbs the harm? Clearly South Africa did, and many LMICs as well. But something happened. South Africa was able to attempt to rebuild. And using the South Africa Medical Research Council, as well as the government and other philanthropic organizations, they were able to build a resilience fund. 400 was committed by the South African government, and 200 was donated by external funders. So by this time, they had 600 million rand. This is $33 million in the Resilience Fund. And this fund has a few characteristics. This fund was specifically for anything for the HIV and TB trials that were midstream, so they were not left alone. So South Africa was able to rebuild. Despite it being a reactive response, we can clearly see that it's possible to be able to rebuild. And some of the characteristics of this fund is clearly co-investment. They didn't do it alone, they still used external funders. There was co-governance within this fund. There was shared decision-making, and now there's local stewardship. At this point, South Africa has some power within the Resilience Fund. And there's domestic ownership. But not to say that this solution can work for each LMIC. This is a limitation. Not every single country can have its own resilience fund. It cannot rebuild in the same way, but we can borrow a few things from South Africa. So first, the Resilience Fund is built on national wealth. It's not an ethical need. So does your country have enough money? Can your government give back and rebuild? Politics will always be there. Donor politics will always be there, but national funds cannot fully shield against that. So that needs to be the back of our mind when we are in partnerships. Equity, some states can absorb shock like South Africa did, while others are still struggling. Other limitations are power. Despite us speaking about power yesterday and today, power cannot be equal. The model does not change who controls global health research. It just creates a co-governance. It creates a platform where we can all share the power, but to what extent? That needs to be decided in partnerships. Resilience, true resilience requires international reforms, not just stronger local ones. Despite South Africa coming up with a resilience fund, they still collaborated with external donors, so it's not just their money. They decided we're going to do it with external funders, but it'll still belong to us. And with this, we have different recommendations, global reforms, and for the governments to be able to come up with protecting continuity of care. This will happen again and again, and we need to be able to take care of ourselves. By that I mean LMICs, just like South Africa did, creating national research budget lines just dedicated for research, to build regional resilience fund and strengthen local decision-making. Because in this we see responsibility and justice being used as the ethical pillars for the governments. Another recommendation would be for the funders. You have contracts, but they went beyond the contract. The contract didn't matter at the time. The political decisions did. So can they give advance notice? And what does that mean for us? And if they do give advance notice, we can still stand on our feet and continue with our research. Co-govern major projects. It so happens that most of the time, LMICs are implementers of research, not co-governance. We are not doing it together, we do the implementation. So funders need to really realize that we want to co-govern most of our projects, providing transition bridge support and maintaining follow-up during disruptions. If there's a disruption, what happens? We need to be notified what's going on. So there needs to be accountability and responsibility by the funders. Lastly is research institutions and global bodies. We need to lead and manage funds locally. This is what I'm saying. We need to ensure that even when we're signing contracts and we're having these partnerships, to what extent do we manage and control? They give us the money, but to what extent do we control the money? Will political decisions made externally affect us? And if it does, can we be able to stand on our own feet like South Africa did with coming up with a resilience fund, though reactive? Conduct equity checks, share authorship and leadership fairly, and adopt ethical donor transition policies. If they're to fall back, what does that mean? What does a transition look like? Why are they transitioning? So we see justice and accountability should be embedded for research institutions and global bodies. And as I conclude, clearly it was not a funding shock, it was a dependency shock. We depend a lot on donor capitals. I think it was a wake-up call for most of the LMICs. And as you can see, South Africa was able, though reactive, was able to attempt to rebuild, and it's continuously rebuilding with commitment of funds. External politics created internal ethical harms. Clearly, we've seen that in the case study. And this dependency is not a failure of South Africa. It was a feature of the global research economy. And I would like to leave you with this. To build resilient partnerships, accountability needs to be shared, responsibility needs to be upheld, and justice needs to be rebalanced. Thank you.
Thanks, Brenda. I now want to invite you to shift focus a little to think about a different kind of fault line in partnerships. And with that, I'm going to call up our third and final presenter, Tao Tran, who will reflect on how participatory methods, which are intended to redistribute power between researchers and participants, can actually exclude community voices through her work in AMR in Vietnam.
This morning, and we're going to go forward now with the plenary discussion, asking you to present us with some questions. And I just want to wrap up in terms of what our presenters have put forward today. Tegu has reflected on the role of language translators as contributors, often unrecognized unpaid, and he's presented to us a model of what I understood being the translation equity assessment tool and what those dynamics entail. Brenda highlighted the significant cracks and the fragility of the funding landscape, identifying and making recommendations for some values that need to be underpinned and brought to the fore, such as care, budget model shifting, and also looking at ways of rebuilding perhaps the funding architecture. And thirdly, Tao has highlighted communities who play a significant role and also multiple tasks that are involved in the research ecosystem, and also looking at the power imbalances from a top-down approach. But she's presented to us some key aspects. One, we need to look at distributive justice and reform, recognizing those who are not necessarily academic or key in the front line of research, but they play a significant role in the research process. And so perhaps that might involve reflexive ethics to support and also look at ways of iterative practices to help recognize those voices who are left out in the process of research. So I'm going to hand over to Marlon to assist us with the plenary discussion session for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to invite some questions. I see a hand. If I miss you, I'm sorry. This light's very bright. I feel like I'm at a concert. There's a hand at the back, I think.
Yes, that's mine. Thank you to our three presenters for those great presentations. I want to start by commenting on the presentation that was given by Tegu regarding those translators, and say that whenever we are dealing with volunteers, I'm concerned about issues of quality. How do you ensure that those translations are of high quality when you're dealing with those volunteers? And then when it comes to the role of those translators, I think there is a clear understanding that they need to be acknowledged on the platform on which they are providing the translations. So they don't qualify as authors in any way because they have not qualified, they have not participated in the writing of those papers. Thirdly, when we look at artificial intelligence with the language models that we have, it actually means within the next 2 years, those translators will now be off the scene because now the computers are going to do the translations for us. And then going on to Brenda. So Brenda, I just wanted to emphasize, I'm from a US university. We were also victims in this as the US partners for South Africa. I also wanted to say that the NIH itself was a victim in all this because decisions were being made by a few individuals who were simply dictating what needed to be done. In the US, there are institutions like Harvard and others that have lost billions of dollars as a result of political decisions by a few individuals. So I want to say specifically that I am with you in these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. As I understand, there are three components of the questions. First is how did we ensure translation quality? Second is that as with current practice, translation works is not actually recognized as part of the authorship of the paper, and then the third one is the role of AI. All right. Question number one, well, we have a process, internal process, in terms of ensuring how the translation is of good quality. Our translators are having a certain level of education. That's for sure, and then many of them are students of health and medical sciences. Some of them are patient carers and so on. And then the next level, we involve editor of translations. And these editor of translations are those who are working as Cochrane Review authors in Malaysia. So they have quite a good knowledge, understanding in terms of evidence synthesis itself. So, and then as a background, we keep trying in terms of how we can improve the process workflow, and then how words or phrases can be translated into local language that really reflect the cultural uniqueness and so on. That's one. The second one, yeah, well, that's precisely something that I detest in this presentation, particularly because translation work is not simply language conduit. There is one saying which I think very good from a translation experts. I can't remember who's the name of that person, that translation is a lot more about understanding your own language rather than understanding the language from which it was translated. So that means it requires knowledge, good skills, good understanding of the local context, which is actually an intellectual work itself. How this should be recognized? If it's not authorship, probably it's something where authorship have its own place, I suppose. I think the real problem here is that the translation work itself is never credited in a way that can contribute to that academic progress or career progress. You are counted in terms of how many publications and scientific journals you create, but you are not counted in terms of how many translations you produce in this context. Well, translation itself is actually an intellectual work. Yeah. Second one, the third one is about the role of AI. Well, as I checked, we have not embedded AI in our translation workflow at the moment, but yes, I can see that coming, and that's what I see now is it's actually a good question in terms of, well, we should probably compare how the translation differs between those that are done by humans and those that are done by AI. I don't have the exact answer at the moment. Yeah, thank you.
I think mine was more of a comment, and I agree we are together, and I acknowledge that NIH were also victims. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Marlene, Jacinta, thank you for the session, and the dear speakers, thank you very much. I have the comment to Tiago. Actually, we never acknowledge our translators in all our studies, so thank you very much for pointing out. Maybe we have acknowledgement section in all our publications. We're grateful to all the participants and partners, and this is idea now from this, because we heavily use translators too, and now I'm thinking we have been using transcribers, because there have been AI tools, but they perfectly would transcribe if it's in English, but since we use Kazakh, Russian, Uzbek, Kyrgyz local languages, AI is not ready to do. And if you have interview outside, it's noise, so AI is not capable to do clearly, so we are using transcribers too. And it's a lot of intellectual, yeah, because sometimes they miss some jargon. So now from this, we will be using acknowledgement section to thank transcribers and translators. Thank you for pointing out. And I have the question to Brenda. We have been affected by NIH cuts and Trump's administration decision heavily in Kazakhstan and Central Asia for all our funding and big research. How did you guys initiate this resilience fund? Like, how did you work with the government to? It was like 3 million, if 2 million the government of South Africa gave it to you. It's like, how did you start this initiative, and what was the key points for the government to convince to continue to fund it? Thank you.
Yeah, okay, fine. Is your question linked to this question, or can we go to Shanuka?
Oh, yeah.
No, I think Shanuka was next. Yeah.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, colleagues. Thank you, Brenda and the team, for a very interesting and exciting presentation. I'm Shanuka Singh. I'm from South Africa, and I play a dual role in the sense that I chair a biomedical research ethics committee at my institution, and I'm also the deputy chair for the National Health Research Ethics Council for South Africa. So it's a regulatory as well as boots on the ground. So in terms, again, Brenda, you very rightfully pointed out how the government came into support. However, there was also a response from research ethics as well, in the sense that one of the things we started asking researchers was around how do you manage the SAEs, your serious adverse events, because that cannot be left aside. So even if it meant forming referral pathways or partnering with local service providers, but to ensure that these research participants are not left in the cold without any kind of support. One of the things that we've done proactively since then is also ensure that in the application form for research ethical clearance is to ask a question: what happens in the case if you have a pause in funding or you have termination in funding? What happens to your study? What happens to study participants? So in that way, we are ensuring that participants are not left out. Secondly, I think it's quite important, again, to look at and strengthening community engagement, because from a government response is one aspect, and like we said again, the government pot is not overflowing. There are challenges in terms of the resources and access to those resources. How do you then sensitize communities to ensure that, yes, we have these clinical funds available, yes, they could be therapeutic interpretation in terms of, is this actually services or is this research? So how do you sensitize your communities? And secondly, ensuring that there is a strong community engagement plan in place. In terms of the access to funding, for the question that was raised, how did the government actually then provide funding? It was advocacy from the various stakeholders, including the South African Health Products Health Authority, which is abbreviated to call SAPRA, which is actually responsible again for monitoring and regulating clinical trials that are held in the country. So it is actually a concerted effort from various role players that we then had a good positive response from the government. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Brenda to respond. And then if Tege has responded to the previous comment as well.
Thank you so much, Shanuka, for the addition, and I think she's answered it really well on how South Africa was able to put in money into the Resilience Fund, and Shanuka, Prof. Shanuka is right. There are so many stakeholders who are able to advocate for the funds to be put in. It's not just the government. It's an advocation from, like she said, the RECs, the different RECs, the government, different external donors as well were part of it. So it has to be all stakeholders and some form of advocacy.
Yeah, right. Thank you very much for the statements, comments. Having putting them into the acknowledgement section is really a good progress. And in Cochrane, we have put their names in acknowledgement part, in translation notes that we say, that we put the name and institution of those who are translating the piece. I was just thinking probably as many translation initiatives as possible can actually join forces to actually make a case, argue to the system that we actually have, where a translation can actually be recognized as an academic work. The most that I can think of, do at the moment, that people actually are trying to suggest, is that to put this as community works. Even that, I find challenges in terms of how many hours it is, because then one translators can actually differ from the other. Yeah, I think that's my comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Enoch Kabene from Cambridge, and my question goes to Brenda about again this resilient fund. First of all, I'm impressed that South Africa took a step to make sure that the resilient fund was availed. I remember when this happened early this year at Cambridge, we had to analyze how many participants have already been enrolled in the various clinical trial research sites in Cambridge, and we noted that there were more than 500 participants who had already enrolled in clinical trials that were directly affected. Some of them were not affected. Out of these 500, a good number of them, I can't remember right now, had already received the intervention. And it was a problem now of imagining how long are we going to follow up these participants, and where are we going to get the funds to follow up these participants. So my question was, this 600 million resilient fund that was availed, was it adequate to follow up the participants, especially those who had already received the intervention, and for how long will it be sustainable to follow up the participants to the end? And are there plans actually to make sure that, at least for those who had not received the intervention, we can just have a way of continuing? But otherwise, for those who had already received the intervention, thank you.
From the research I did, it says that so far the Resilience Fund was focused on just the withdrawal for HIV and TB. So I'm not really sure to what extent the 600 million rand went through. Maybe I can check, but I'm not really sure how the money was allocated. But maybe someone.
Yeah, I think for us as a community here today, one of the things that did come across in South African context around the research funding, it was a clear message for diversification, to ensure that there's always contingency plans and continuity of the research. And that was something that didn't just come within the community. Government itself said researchers need to be thinking about ways that we could put to the table around how we can diversify and ensure that there isn't, or if there is, these incidents or events like we've experienced, how can we address and respond appropriately? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I think Mike, I see Fari, and then I think Gustavo has a question. So, in the front, I don't know if there's...
Thanks very much. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. My question is for Tautran. Thank you very much, first of all, for a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it a lot. Thinking about the Vietnamese context in particular, I was wondering, so you talked about bureaucracy and government structures and how they can sometimes slow things down or get in the way. I just wondered whether there is any possible future you could imagine in which some of those structures could be helpful. So I'm thinking about my understanding of Vietnamese, that the government structures down to the level of the commune, for example. I just wondered, is there any possible way in which you could imagine those structures being useful as a way of recognizing the kind of partnerships you want to recognize?
Thank you. That's a good question. I think the structure of governance that I've described works actually very well in terms of efficiency. So if there is something that the government finds that they should focus on, if there is political interest in the issue, then there are ways that they can mobilize the community. And actually this happened during COVID-19, where actually we as a nation, we talk about how we have solidarity and how we have come together many times before during all the wars that we went through. And then this was very effective, I think, during the pandemic, to talk about how we should all think about others, how we should think about how our actions are affecting the health of others. So we may practice social distancing and hygiene behavior that then can help to prevent the spread of COVID to other people. I do think that where there is interest, then there are good ethical values and there are great traditions there that can be mobilized. But then the problem in the case of AMR is actually to reach an agreed agenda with the government and the local expert partners in terms of how can AMR be appropriately incorporated into local public health and research agendas. I hope that answered your question.
Oh, thank you for the great presentations. So mine is a question that is really coming from Brenda's presentation, but I think also to pick up from Shanika's question or response, which is also very interesting to me. I was curious to know, because she indicated that I think they have included a question in the maybe ethics review process to say to the researchers, what measures are you going to take when maybe funding is cut? How are you going to deal with that? So I was just curious to know some of the acceptable responses that maybe the IRB can use to approve an application, especially when they respond to such a question. And also how much weight does that aspect have in terms of ethical decision making for that to be approved? Thank you.
Prof. Shanuka, I think this is for you.
Thank you so much for that question. So this is again about asking researchers to think beyond the budget that they are working on and to put in a contingency plan in terms of what happens if there is sudden freeze of the funds, etc. Because remember, these are humans that we're dealing with. People that have problems, people that are on an intervention that you don't know what the effect is going to be like. And how do you then plan for an SAE? So we are not talking about the entire project, but rather in terms of what happens and how do you deal with patient safety, patient management thereafter. And I think that would be the priority of an ethics reviewer in terms of looking at what kind of support is being provided for research participants. So that would be the priority that I would focus on as a reviewer, and not necessarily set a particular standard that's going to then determine as a cutoff point in terms of what is going to allow that ethical clearance process to go through. Rather, it's an engagement. Because remember, again, we're responding to a particular issue that occurred that no one was actually prepared for. So it is a reaction to a particular situation. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Prof. Well, IRB's recs should have to look at contingency plans in proposals as well, just to make sure that if something like this was to happen, if a crisis like this was to happen, then these are the things that researchers are putting in mind for participants. So that would be something maybe researchers need to think about while coming up with their proposals.
Yeah, all right. Can I comment on your case, Brenda? I think it's very interesting. I'm trying to look at from the perspective of the funder accountability. I mean, when the project have run to a certain extent, where then it really dictates the life of that many people, and what I mean by people were research participants, then the fact that we don't have that system that ensures accountability of the funder, the fact that the funding can actually be cut just overnight, that's actually something. So, right.
Yeah, I think everyone was shocked by how the crisis disrupted so much of research, and I think so many people felt it in that way.
I think in our breakaway groups, we're probably going to have more discussion about this, but beyond the context of just, research ethics committees do play a role, IRBs do play a role, researchers do need to be thinking about their funding and what stopgap measures could they be considering to mitigate those kinds of risks. But I do think even at an institutional level, not just governments, but institutions also need to, because they are the ones that are oftentimes within the research community asking of the researchers to how are they seeking grants, looking at ways to develop their careers, and of course the research, responding to the research agenda of the country in terms of the different issues we're faced with. And I think that at institutional level, there needs to be a shift in the lens of the way we are looking or framing our research models so that we can assist or provide measures or mechanisms to assist researchers at the varying levels and the varying degrees of the types of research that is housed in those institutions. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for one, maybe two. Okay, fine. Two questions, but very quick questions. Okay, Gustavo and then Yantina.
Well, I think that, my commentary is not exactly a question, but try to reflect with you all. So congratulations for all the presenters, and especially for the subject of this theme. So especially to bring economics and politics in these contests. And I would like to agree with Tegu, so because he brings sometimes it's a very old-fashioned view about political economy and taking the Marxist approach in this kind of social and an economic structure. So for me, in terms of a structure of health researcher, the funding's distribution is completely unfair, right? More than 50% of the research funding comes from the US, and then the rest is divided Europe and the rest of the world. So why this is important in terms of political economy? So this very old perspective, the division of center and periphery, the developed countries and low and middle-income countries, and we continue to reproduce this kind of order, right? Even in this event, in an event like this, we continue to reproduce this kind of categories. The second point is about research agenda. So when I heard you also how research agenda is organized by the funders and the global north needs. There are many invisible social and health needs in our countries that's completely invisible, or, well, the funders, they don't care about this. So look at, for instance, the arbovirus diseases. Now in Europe is a lot of threats about arbovirus disease and climate change. So now this is important to respond to arbovirus diseases. So and TB and HIV, especially in African countries, and many other things. So the second point is how we can break the path dependence of our local governments from international fundings. So how to stimulate local governments to financing. So it's important to say we don't have much funding for research. We need to respond to other needs. So, but it's also reflect in many things. So, for instance, during the 90s, Brazil broke the intellectual property and patents related to antiretrovirus. So we could produce the antiretrovirus, but it was prohibited to export for no-profit regions for African countries, for instance. So it's still prohibitive for us. And we continue to produce the antiretrovirus vaccines. The other example is about COVID-19 vaccine. So we received the technological transfer to produce COVID-19 from Oxford AstraZeneca. But it also prohibitive we cannot observe in the national context to export to other countries this point. And so just to finalizing, what this kind of political economic dimension also influence in intellectual property. So we usually to be field work and especially clinical trial to produce vaccine and other medicines, and we don't have any share or benefits about intellectual property. So there's a countries like Brazil that we can produce this kind of a medicine. So what is kind of a benefit to take part of these clinical trials? This is not new questions, but I think it's important to bring to this discussion. I'm sorry, I extended.
Thanks, Gustavo. Those are really great and big questions that I will ask for very brief reactions from, and I'm sure they'll stimulate lots of discussion in the groups just now. But just in the interest of time, I'm just going to ask Antina to ask her question before we break.
Okay, cool. It's not a question either. It's an observation, and I thoroughly enjoyed your session. But I also think that it's very important to always be mindful that we need to tell complex stories and not simple stories. And that the act of telling a single story, I was just reading Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's lovely speech that she gave, or TED talk that she gave on the danger of a single story. And so especially Brenda and Tegu, I was involved in some role in a big EU project where they were using lots of unpaid PhD students because it was good for their careers to do lots of translation of websites for the project. So the unpaid labor problem is a complex problem. I enjoyed your presentation, but it's really important to not position that as a uniquely global North-South problem. Brenda, there's a wonderful book called Global Knowledge, Global Power that illustrates really wonderfully how South African HIV and TB researchers have very skillfully navigated a landscape in which they're positioned as being dependent to become leaders. And the analysis there is a Southern theory analysis. And so agency, if the story you tell is the story of dependency, then over time all that we see becomes dependency. Yet obviously, that's not the full story. In fact, South African researchers are very skillful. South African MRC funds this GFBR. It's the only partner in the Global South. And so there's very interesting dynamics of dependency and agency and how those are navigated. And that, too, is an ethical story.
Thanks, Antina. We are over time, but I was wondering if you have just, are there responses? Just quickly.
So, well, thank you very much for the responses. I remember yesterday's discussion in Group 1. So we talk about, I mentioned something about resource limited setting, that in research, I don't think there is such thing as resource limited setting, because you wouldn't do any research if the resource is limited, because the dynamics that we just accept now is that funding really tells everything. Somebody from our group mentioned how money has been overvalued in determining the dynamics of the work itself. That's one. And then second, yes, thank you for reminding me about unpaid labor. Really, of course, that is something that we recognize. The thing that I think I'd like to highlight there is how we can actually appreciate the value of the labor in one way or another. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to our three presenters for really interesting and rich case studies. Thanks everyone for your participation. We are now going to break into our groups of yesterday, same people, same places, and I want to remind you to please ensure that within your discussion that you try and think about these case studies and the kinds of richness that it was presented in. Thank you.